The floorboards are always coldest right before 4 in the morning. Sarah could feel the draft slipping under the kitchen door, sharp and thin, pressing against her bare ankles. In her right hand, the canvas strap of the old market bag dug into her skin, its coarse, unwashed threads rough and biting. In her left, the brass handle of the kerosene lantern felt heavy, slick with a microscopic film of oil. The smell of it filled the small, square kitchen, sharp, metallic, and old. Upstairs, her children were sleeping. If she listened closely, past the rhythmic ticking of the battery-operated clock on the mantel, she could hear the faint, collective murmur of their breath. Small chests rising and falling under heavy, hand-stitched quilts. They slept with the absolute, unblemished trust of the young, believing the roof above them was solid, and the world beneath them was fixed. Sarah stood between the back door and the wooden table where she had rolled out pie crusts just 12 hours earlier. The air was thick with the faint, lingering scent of lard and nutmeg. Everything was perfectly still. But it was not the stillness of rest. It was the breathless, suffocating quiet that settles over a valley right before the sky turns purple and the trees twist backward in a storm. She looked at the yellow circle of light the lantern cast on the linoleum floor. Then she set the canvas bag down on the bench. Her fingers, stiff from the chill, untied the cloth strings. One by one, she lifted the items out. 3 dark blue dresses. 4 white prayer caps, nested carefully inside one another so the pleats wouldn't crush. Stiff black stockings. She walked to the dresser in the corner, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards she had scrubbed on her knees every Friday of her adult life. She placed the clothes back into the drawer. The wood slid home with a soft, hollow thud. She leaned over the glass chimney of the lantern. She drew a short breath and blew. The flame sputtered, turned blue, and vanished, leaving behind the bitter, stinging scent of a dying wick. She walked back up the stairs in the pitch black, her feet, finding the center of each step by memory alone, avoiding the third riser because it always groaned. Nobody knew. Not the women who would sit beside her at the quilting frame the following Thursday, their fingers moving in perfect, synchronized rhythm through the batting. Not the deacon's wife who would walk through her garden in May, pointing her calico-covered finger at the pale green shoots of sugar peas. Not the bishop who had dipped his hands in water to baptize her when she was 16, and who had stood at the front of the church when she took her wedding vows. They would look at her and see exactly what they expected to see. A quiet woman, a good mother, a faithful wife. My name is Lavina. I grew up inside the heavy protective embrace of the old order Amish community. If you look at our world from the outside, through the window of a passing car or the glossy pages of a travel guide, it looks like a painting. You see the rolling green hills of Ohio or Pennsylvania, the white laundry billowing like sails against a clean blue sky, the steady, comforting clop of horses on a gravel road. You see a life unhurried by the frantic noise of the modern world, and for many, that picture is entirely true. I have sat in kitchens filled with genuine laughter, where marriages are quiet sanctuaries and children grow up, wrapped in a safety so thick it feels physical. The traditions aren't a burden to them. They are a warm coat against the winter, but a painting does not have a pulse. It does not bleed. The Amish world is made of human beings, and human beings carry the same fractured, fragile nature inside a buggy as they do inside a sports car. The same capacity for darkness exists under a wide-brimmed straw hat as it does anywhere else. Have you ever stood in your own life, holding a packed bag in the dark, torn between the safety of everything you know and the terrifying necessity of the unknown? Have you ever had to unpack that bag because the world outside felt too vast and the world inside felt too heavy? If you want to understand the quiet strength it takes to survive those moments, and the hidden realities of the lives we live behind closed doors, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We sit down together every week to look at these stories, honestly and without judgment. Sarah understood the weight of that silence better than most. Growing up, she had watched her mother move through their home with a peculiar, fluid grace. She moved around Sarah's father the way water moves around a large, jagged stone in a creek bed. Gently, quietly, always finding a path that didn't cause a splash or disturb the current. As a child, Sarah thought this was simply what it meant to be a woman. The stone was the stone. The water simply went around it because that was its nature. It wasn't until she was much older, standing in her own kitchen with her own stone occupying the center of the room, that she realized the terrifying truth. The water doesn't move around the stone out of preference. It moves because if it strikes the stone directly, it breaks. To understand why Sarah put her clothes back in that drawer, you have to understand what it means to be a wife here. In the community, marriage is not a contract based on shifting feelings. It is a holy covenant woven into the fabric of the church itself. The Ordnung, the spoken and unspoken rules that guide us, places enormous value on keeping that structure intact. A good wife is taught from her earliest youth to be patient, to be long-suffering, to bear the faults of her husband with a quiet, prayerful spirit. And here is the tragic friction of it. The people who teach these things, the mothers, the ministers, the neighbors, they do not do it out of cruelty. They do it out of a sincere, deeply rooted desire to protect the peace of the colony and the salvation of the soul. But when those virtues of endurance and silence are twisted, when they are placed into the hands of a man who uses them to control, those beautiful virtues slowly turn into the bars of a cage. The system doesn't fail because it is evil. It fails because it cannot see that the very medicine it prescribes for a broken home is sometimes the very thing that poisons it. Sarah didn't stay because she was weak, or because she didn't know any better. She stayed because she had a deep, genuine faith in the world that had raised her. She believed that if she just prayed harder, if she was just a little more compliant, a little quieter, God would soften the hard edges of her husband, Daniel. She was living inside a framework that simply had no language for the kind of slow, invisible erosion that was happening beneath her roof. Daniel was not a man who raised his fists, at least not in those early years. He didn't have to. His control was built out of smaller, colder materials. It was the deliberate way he would look past her when she spoke, as if her voice were nothing more than a draft of wind through a broken pane. It was the way he managed the farm books, keeping the money so tightly guarded that she had to ask permission for the price of a box of canning lids, leaving her perpetually off balance, never knowing if the ground beneath her feet was secure. It was the slow, systematic way he undermined her decisions with the children, using a single tone of voice to erase her authority until she felt like a ghost in her own house. It is like snow. A single snowflake weighs nothing. It disappears the moment it touches your skin. But if it keeps falling day after day, hour after hour, without a break in the weather, the weight accumulates. Eventually, the timber groans. Eventually, the roof collapses. When people from the outside hear about women like Sarah, they always ask the same question. It is a question born of a world with different horizons. They ask, why didn't she just walk out? But they do not see the walls. Leaving an Amish marriage doesn't mean changing your address or getting a lawyer. It means stepping off the edge of the known earth. It means facing the possibility of the shunning. It means your own mother cannot sit at the same table with you. It means your sisters cannot accept a gift from your hand. It means walking into a loud, flashing English world with nothing but a canvas bag, completely unprepared for the language, the bills, the isolation. For an Amish woman, leaving doesn't just mean ending a marriage. It means choosing to become a ghost to everyone who ever loved you. Sarah stood in that dark kitchen, balancing the weight of the canvas bag against the weight of her entire world. And that night, the world won. She chose the familiar ache over the unfamiliar terror. But the story didn't end there, because beneath the surface of that quiet valley, things were already moving. Other women were watching. Other eyes were tracking the late-arriving smiles, and the way she held her children just a little too tightly when the church wagons gathered in the lane. To understand the night Sarah packed that canvas bag, we have to go back 9 years, to a Tuesday in November when the ground was already hard as iron. Daniel was 22 then. He was a man who could cut 3 cords of wood before noon without losing his breath. He had dark, serious eyes, and a way of holding himself that made the other young men step aside when he walked into the auction barn. Sarah was 19, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the wood stove, her apron crisp and white. On their wedding day, the church was so crowded, the windows fogged from the breath of 200 people. The bishop stood before them for 2 hours, his voice rising and falling like the wind in the pines, speaking about the holy order of the home. "The husband is the head," he said. "The wife is the heart. The vine does not argue with the trellis. It clings to it, and in that clinging it finds its strength." Sarah had nodded, her eyes fixed on the black scuff marks on the floorboards. She felt a deep, swelling pride. She wanted to be the vine. She wanted to give Daniel a home that smelled of yeast and beeswax, a place where the noise of the world could never enter. In those first years, the rules of the Ordnung felt like a fence built to keep the wolves out. You wore the same dress as your neighbors because pride was a disease. You didn't own a car because speed tore families apart. You didn't have electricity because the wires brought the outside world directly through your walls. It all made sense. The community was an island of safety in a vast, chaotic sea. But fences don't just keep things out. They keep things in. The change in Daniel didn't happen like a thunderstorm. It happened like the rot in a cellar beam, slow, damp, and invisible from the kitchen above. It began the winter their second child was born. Daniel had bought a team of bay horses from an English farmer 3 miles over. One of them had a bad habit of throwing its head when the harness slipped over its ears. One evening, Daniel came into the kitchen after dark. The wind was rattling the loose pane in the pantry window. He didn't take off his coat. He just stood by the wood stove, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His knuckles were raw, scraped pink by the cold leather of the rains. Sarah was sitting in the rocking chair, nursing the baby. The stew was bubbling on the back of the stove, smelling of onions and turnip greens. "The horse is ruined," Daniel said. His voice wasn't loud. It was flat, like a stone dropped in dry grass. "Can you trade him back?" Sarah asked softly. Keeping her eyes on the baby's small, rhythmic fingers, Daniel didn't answer. He walked over to the table, took the ceramic sugar bowl Sarah's mother had given her, and turned it over. The white granules spilled across the dark oilcloth, mounding like a miniature drift of snow. He took his thumb and pressed it into the center of the mound, crushing the sweet crystals until they ground against the wood beneath. "You didn't check the harness," he said. "I didn't know you wanted me to, Daniel," she whispered. Her heart gave a hard, sudden wallop against her ribs, but her face remained as still as milk in a pan. "A wife knows what her husband needs before he asks," he said. He looked at her then, his eyes empty of any anger, which made it worse. It was the look a man gives a fence post that isn't sitting straight. Clean it up. She didn't say a word, she didn't cry. To cry was to show impatience with the life God had appointed for her. She waited until the door clicked shut behind him as he went back to the barn. Then she set the sleeping baby in the cradle, got her rag and wiped the sugar into her palm. Her internal voice was a frantic, repeating prayer. "Make me humbler. Lord, take the pride out of my heart. Let me be a better wife." Outwardly, when Daniel came back in for supper, she handed him his plate, smiled her quiet, expected smile, and asked if he wanted more coffee. The years disciplined her into a perfect silence. She learned to read the tilt of his hat on the peg by the door. If it was straight, the children could laugh at the table. If it was tilted low, she would usher them upstairs before the boots were even off his feet. She became an expert in the mathematics of survival, subtracting her own voice from every room so that his could occupy the entire house. The turning point came 4 years later, on a Friday night in October. The air smelled of wood smoke and dropped apples rotting in the orchard. The children were supposed to be asleep upstairs, but Levi, who was 5, had a cough that kept him restless. Daniel was sitting at the desk in the corner, counting the money from the alfalfa sale. Sarah was mending a tear in his gray winter trousers. The needle was small and slick between her calloused fingers. "The count is short," Daniel said. Sarah kept her needle moving, up and down. "The buyer said the second cutting was light, Daniel. He told you that at the gate." Daniel stood up. The wooden chair didn't scrape. He lifted it and set it down without a sound. He walked over to her chair and took her by the chin. His thumb pressed into the soft skin right beneath her jawbone, just hard enough to stop her breath if she tried to swallow. "Are you telling me I don't know my own business?" he asked. She didn't move. She didn't pull away. If she pulled away, it would be considered defiance, and defiance inside an Amish home is a fire that burns everything down. She looked into his dark eyes, her own reflection tiny and trapped in his pupils. "No, Daniel," she said, her voice thin as a thread. Inside her head, a cold, clear light snapped on. It wasn't a prayer this time. It was a realization that arrived with the sharpness of an axe-splitting pine. "He likes this. He doesn't want me to be better. He wants me to be nothing." A floorboard creaked behind them. Daniel didn't let go of her jaw immediately. He turned his head slowly. Little Levi was standing in the doorway of the stairs, his flannel nightshirt too short for his ankles, his eyes wide and round in the lamplight. He had his small wooden horse tucked under one arm. He wasn't crying, but his mouth was open, his breath coming in short, dry gasps. Daniel released her. He smoothed his apron with both hands, his face returning to its calm, respectable mask. "Go back to bed, Levi," Daniel said. His voice was warm now, the voice he used when he spoke to the deacon after church. "Your mother and I are just talking." Sarah stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to press her thighs against the sewing table to stay upright. She walked to the doorway, knelt down in front of her son, and tucked his hair behind his ears. Her hands were ice cold, but her face was perfectly serene. "It's all right, Bockley," she whispered, using the old German pet name. "Go on up. I'll bring your cough syrup in a minute." Levy looked at her, his eyes searching hers for the truth. She gave him the smile she had practiced for 9 years, the one that reached her eyes but didn't warm them. The boy turned and went up the dark stairs, his bare feet patting against the wood. Sarah stood up and turned to face the kitchen. Daniel was already back at his desk, his pencils scratching figures onto the yellow pad, as if the room were empty. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of an Amish wife. They were stained with walnut juice from the hulling, scarred from the garden hoe, lined with the grease of 1,000 suppers. For 9 years, those hands had built a fortress of patience around her family. But as she stood there, watching the pencil move in Daniel's hand, she realized the fortress was a tomb, and the door was already closing on her children. The summer after Levi saw his father's hand on Sarah's jaw was the hottest July the valley had seen in 30 years. The air didn't move. It sat over the metal roofs of the barns like a wet wool blanket, thick and smelling of baked dirt, stagnant creek water, and the sharp green bitterness of bruised tomato vines. Sarah was standing in the garden patch behind the house, her bare feet buried 3 inches deep in the dust of the rows. She was picking early horn carrots, pulling them from the dry earth with a dull scraping sound. Her fingers were stained dark orange and gray from the soil. Every few minutes, she had to stop to wipe the sweat from her forehead with the edge of her sleeve, leaving a streak of clay across her skin. An older woman was working 3 rows over. It was Ruth, a neighbor whose farm joined theirs at the Line Creek. Ruth was 60 then, her face lined like a walnut shell from decades of working under the basin of the sky. She moved slowly, her heavy black shoes sinking into the dirt, her sunbonnet casting a deep purple shadow over her eyes. A crow called out from the top of the silo, a sudden piercing shriek that broke the heavy midday quiet. Sarah didn't just look up. Her whole body leaped. The carrot in her hand slipped, its green tops tearing away, leaving the root buried in the dark. Her breath caught in the back of her throat, a small clicking sound like a latch dropping into place. Ruth didn't drop her basket. She didn't even look toward the silo. She kept her back bent, her old hands moving through the weed growth with steady, unhurried rhythm. But she spoke, her voice low and dry, barely carrying across the red pepper plants between them. "A chimney that draws backward will fill the whole house with smoke, Sarah," Ruth said. She didn't look up from her work. She picked a yellow caterpillar off a leaf, rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, and dropped it into the dust. "You can scrub the hearth every morning until the stones turn white, but you can't breathe if you keep pretending the air is clear." The words hung in the hot air between them, heavier than the humidity. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. To acknowledge the smoke meant acknowledging the fire, and the fire was something she was still trying to carry in her apron pockets, without burning her clothes. She simply knelt back down, her knees pressing into the hot dirt, and dug her fingers into the earth to find the broken root. Looking back now across the years that separate me from that garden, I see the terrible, intricate machinery of that choices. From the outside, it is so easy to call it cowardice. It is so easy for someone who has never worn a prayer cap to say that Sarah should have screamed, that she should have run to the road, that she should have broken the windows to let the air in. But what the outside world rarely understands is the price of the peace she was trying to buy. In our community, the greatest virtue a woman can possess is a meek and quiet spirit. It is spoken of in the church benches every Sunday. It is praised at the end of a long life when a woman is laid in the ground in her white cape and apron. The women who can bear the heaviest loads without their faces showing the strain, they are the ones who are held up as holy. They are the ones the younger girls are told to follow. That was the trap. The emotional price Sarah paid wasn't just the fear of Daniel's silence or the coldness of his look across the supper table. The true cost was the total surrender of her own reality. Every time Daniel undermined her, every time he used his authority to make her feel small, the community looked at her endurance and called it beautiful. Her mother looked at her silence and called it faithfulness. The ministers looked at her family and saw a well-ordered home, a testament to the strength of the Ordnung. She was being praised for her own disappearance. The holier she appeared to the church, the closer she was to being erased entirely. This is the tragic friction of a traditional life. The people around Sarah, the deacon's wife who brought her sour cherry pies when she was sick, her mother who helped her sew the children's winter coats, the bishop who reminded her of her vows. They didn't want her to suffer. They genuinely loved her. They wanted her soul to be safe in the eternity after this one. But their tools for saving her soul were the very things that were killing her spirit. They knew how to fix a broken wagon wheel. They knew how to tend a cow with milk fever, but they had no medicine for a man who used the words of Scripture to systematically break his wife's will. To them, a broken marriage was a greater sin than a broken woman. Because a broken woman could still sit in the church bench. A broken woman could still bake the bread for the council meeting. But a broken marriage tore a hole in the white fabric of the community itself. And that was something the elders would spend any amount of silence to prevent. Sarah knew this without ever having to be told. She knew that if she spoke the truth out loud, the community wouldn't come down on Daniel with fists. They would come down on both of them with a heavy, suffocating blanket of counsel. They would tell them to pray more. They would tell Daniel to be gentler, and they would tell Sarah to be more submissive, as if the problem were a scale that simply needed to be balanced by two equal weights. She stood in the middle of that July garden, her hands covered in dirt, looking at the roof of her house. It looked solid from where she stood. The white paint was clean. The tin roof reflected the blue of the sky like water. It looked exactly like the paintings the English tourists bought at the shops on the highway. But inside, her son Levi was learning how to be silent when his father entered a room. And her daughters were learning how to look at the floor when a man spoke, the weight of the canvas bag she would pack. A few months later, didn't start the night she stood in the dark kitchen. It started here, under the noon sun, when she realized that the fence built to keep her safe was the very thing preventing anyone from hearing her drown. Today, Sarah's hair is a soft, pewter gray beneath her white prayer cap, the silver strands catching the thin afternoon light on the porch. The canvas bag she packed and unpacked all those years ago is gone, replaced by the mundane, heavy rhythms of an old marriage. Her children are grown now, their own families established on farms across the valley. Their lives whole and safe because of a line their mother drew in the dust when they were too small to understand it. Daniel still sits at the head of the long oak table, but he is a smaller man now. His shoulders curved inward, like the pages of a book that has been left out in the rain. He carries a visible, ongoing remorse, not expressed in loud, dramatic confessions, which are not our way, but in the slow, unspectacular work of a man who changed because he had to. He passes the bread before he is asked. He steps back to let Sarah pass through the doorway first. The silence in their house is different now. It is no longer a frozen pond waiting to crack under a heavy boot. It is just the quiet of two people who survived a winter they never speak of. But what Sarah carries most from those years isn't the memory of the cold linoleum or the pressure of Daniel's thumb on her jaw. It is what Ruth told her years later on that same porch, about Anna, the bishop's wife, the realization that Anna had gone to her husband 3 times, facing his disapproval, risking her own peace, and finally bypassing his authority to go to Ruth. That changed the geometry of everything for Sarah. It was a terrible, beautiful understanding. The system hadn't failed because it was moving too slowly. The system had been working exactly as it was built to work, choosing the preservation of the community's outward peace over the safety of a woman inside her own home. The only reason Sarah survived was because one woman inside that system decided, at great personal cost, that she would not let it keep working that way. Every community has the capacity to be the thing that breaks the people inside it. And every community has the capacity to be the thing that catches them. The Amish world is not different from yours in this. It is not the wide-brimmed hats, the lanterns, or the absence of wires that determines the spirit of a place. It is the living choices of the people who inhabit it. It is the choice of a Ruth to put the kettle on without asking questions. It is the choice of an Anna to say that doing nothing is wrong, even when the man she trusts most tells her to be silent. If you are sitting with the weight of Sarah's story right now, I want to ask you something honestly. What would you have done if you were the one holding that canvas bag in the dark kitchen at 4 a.m? Would you have folded the clothes back into the drawer to protect your children's world, or would you have stepped out into the cold? I don't ask this to judge the stayers or the leavers. I ask it because the true answer for most of us is that we do not know. We like to believe we would be brave, but we have never carried the weight of that particular faith, that particular love, and that specific terror all tangled together so tightly they cannot be separated. That uncertainty should make us slower to judge and quicker to look closely at the people around us. Please share your heart in the comments below. If there is a Sarah in your world, in any community, I hope you will find the courage to be a Ruth to her. And if you want to keep exploring these deep, hidden corners of human experience, if you want to hear the stories that never make it into the brochures, take a moment to subscribe for our weekly essays. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. Until next time, this is Lavina from Lavina the Amish Girl.